Park Jae-Min, known to the underworld as the White Tiger, sat beneath amber lights that cast long, sharp shadows across his weathered face. His tailored black suit was slightly rumpled, marked by the faint copper scent of blood from an earlier encounter he'd barely survived. He sat with a rigid, unshakable authority, his eyes cold and calculating, the look of a king who had stared down death so many times that he no longer bothered to blink. To the world, he was a titan of industry. To those who knew his real name, he was a predator, cornered but not yet broken. Zara Quinn moved through the room like smoke through a keyhole. She didn't offer the performative, bright smiles of the other waitresses. Her face carried the heavy stillness of someone who had seen the world's darkest corners and survived them in silence. Her hands, steady as a sniper's, balanced a serving tray with 2 glasses of wine, even as the air in the room grew thick with the static of an impending strike. Jae-Min noticed her, not because of her grace, but because of her eyes. She wasn't scanning the room for empty glasses, she was mapping approach vectors and identifying exits with a soldier's clinical instinct. Her posture suggested a coiled readiness, a weapon waiting for the safety to be flicked off. At 11 p.m., the illusion of civilization shattered. The restaurant's glass facade didn't just break, it detonated. In the heartbeat before the first executioner could fire, Zara Quinn's world shifted from the mundane to the lethal. To understand how a waitress became the only shield between a mafia boss and a firing squad, you have to understand that Zara wasn't born in the kitchens of Los Angeles. She was forged as Specter, a shadow born in government programs designed to do work the world would never acknowledge. Tonight, a rival syndicate had come to execute a king. They believed they had accounted for every guard and every camera. What they didn't calculate was the woman they had never bothered to see, the ghost who was about to remind them why you should never hunt a tiger in a room guarded by a specter. Before we step further into the wreckage to see what happens next, I want to take a heartbeat to thank you for being here. This story is built on shadows and secrets, but your support is what brings it into the light. Drop a comment and let me know which city or corner of the world you're tuning in from today. I read every one of them. It helps me know who's standing in the dark with me as this journey unfolds. The sirens were a dissonant chorus against the shattering glass as Park Jae-Min moved toward the service exit, his stride possessing a predatory focus that ignored the carnage behind him. Zara followed, her pulse a rhythmic hammer against her ribs, her body still humming with the electric charge of synchronized violence. They didn't speak until they were encased in the armored shell of his Mercedes, the city blurring into a smear of neon and rain. Jae-Min gripped the wheel with knuckles turned white, his jaw set in a line of granite that brooked no deception. "Who are you?" he demanded, the words less a question and more a command for surrender. He didn't look at her, but his presence radiated a heat that made the small space between them feel like a pressure cooker. Zara leaned back against the leather, her eyes still mapping the rooftops and blind spots of the passing streets. "Someone who should have stayed invisible," she whispered, her voice thick with the realization that the mask of Zara Quinn had been burned away, leaving only the jagged edges of Specter. "Invisible people don't move like soldiers or fight like operatives," Jae-Min countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, rough whisper. He swung the car into the underground garage of a downtown high-rise that wore its wealth like armor. They ascended in a service elevator that smelled of ozone and cold steel, the silence between them heavy with the weight of things unsaid. When the doors opened into his penthouse, a 42nd-floor fortress of glass and concrete, Zara immediately scanned for exit strategies and sightlines. Jae-Min moved to a bar cart, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid with hands that were finally, almost imperceptibly, beginning to shake. He handed her a glass, their fingers brushing, a brief electric jolt of recognition that made her breath stutter. "Specter," he said, the name sounding like a prayer and a curse in the quiet room. "I've heard whispers of a ghost that destabilized governments and left no footprints. Why is that ghost serving wine in my restaurant?" Zara took a sip of the single malt, the burn of it anchoring her to the moment. She turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the traffic crawl below like illuminated blood cells. "Because running gets exhausting," she admitted, her reflection showing an exhaustion she usually hid. "And sometimes you get tired of being no one, even if being someone gets you killed." Jae-Min stepped closer, his body heat radiating across the space, his eyes dark with a want that went beyond survival. "You saved my life," he said softly. "Now tell me how many people are coming to take yours." The shadows in the penthouse felt heavier than the city's smog, thick with the history of two people who had spent their lives as weapons. Zara stood by the glass, her fingers tracing a jagged scar on her forearm that the white lace of her uniform could no longer hide. She began to speak, her voice a low mechanical hum that sounded like a readout of a classified file. She described the Black Ops program that had carved Specter out of a girl with nothing left to lose, a ghost division that officially did not exist, where operatives were treated as expendable hardware. They hadn't just trained her, they had dismantled her, turning her empathy into a tactical liability and her identity into a series of aliases. When the work became too dark even for the shadows, they tried to decommission her, a polite term for a shallow grave, forcing her to bury herself in the anonymity of service work just to stay breathing. Jae-Min listened with a stillness that suggested he was hearing his own echo. He set his glass down, the click of crystal on marble echoing like a gunshot. He didn't offer pity. He offered the truth of the white tiger. He spoke of Busousan, a place where honesty was a death sentence, and the docks were controlled by beasts who fed on fear. He told her about his father, a fisherman who refused to pay protection money and was beaten into the dirt while a 15-year-old Jae-Min watched from the periphery. That was the moment the boy died and the monster was born. He hadn't joined the gangs for wealth. He had infiltrated them to systematically dismantle them from the inside, learning their secrets just to burn their world to ash. "I became a monster to kill the monsters," he said, his voice a rough vibration that bridged the distance between them. "And now I sit in a palace built on corpses, wondering if there's enough whiskey in the world to wash away the smell of the docks." Zara turned from the window, finding his gaze. For the first time, the Specter saw something other than a target or a client. She saw a mirror. They were both broken things that had learned to live with the cracks, two ghosts haunted by the very empires they had built or destroyed. The air between them crackled with a new, dangerous understanding. They weren't just partners in survival, they were the only two people on Earth who truly knew what the other was hiding. The silence of the penthouse was a physical weight, broken only by the low hum of the city's indifferent pulse 40 floors below. Park Jae-Min leaned against the dark marble of the kitchen island, his thumb tracing the rim of his empty glass with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He looked at Zara, not as a patron looking at a servant, but as a man who had finally found the missing piece of a violent puzzle. He knew that the syndicate's hit at the restaurant hadn't been a random act of aggression. It was a surgical strike enabled by a leak so deep it threatened to hollow out his entire empire from the inside. "I have dozens of men who will die for me," Jae-Min said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that vibrated in the small space between them. But I don't have anyone who can see the knives coming before they're drawn. I need a ghost to catch a traitor." He stepped closer, his shadow merging with hers against the floor-to-ceiling glass. $10 million. Not for your service, but for your proximity. Stay within my reach until the mole is found, and the money is yours to disappear forever. Zara didn't flinch at the figure. To anyone else, it was a fortune. To her, it was the price of a target on her back. She processed the offer with the cold internal logic of an operative, calculating the risk of visibility against the necessity of resources. She knew that if she walked out those doors now, she would be hunting alone. But if she stayed, she became the anchor in a storm that was only just beginning. "I don't want your money, Jae-Min," she said, her voice like flint striking steel as she turned to meet his dark, expectant gaze. "And I don't take orders. If I do this, it isn't as your employee or your weapon." She invaded his space, her presence as sharp and dangerous as the blade hidden in her boot. "I am your partner. Equal say, equal risk. I have full access to your intelligence, your contacts, and your trust. If I smell a lie, from the mole or from you, the deal is done." A slow, predatory smile touched Jae-Min's lips, one that held a spark of genuine, devastating approval. He didn't hesitate. He extended a hand that was still stained with the copper residue of the night's carnage. "Partners, then," he agreed, his voice a vow that settled between them like a contract signed in blood. As Zara took his hand, her grip firm and calloused, she felt the electric charge of a choice that could no longer be undone. They were two monsters deciding to burn together, and for the first time in years, the Specter felt the dangerous warmth of a purpose that went beyond mere survival. The smell of ozone and wet pavement was the only warning before the world outside the penthouse turned into an inferno. Zara was in the kitchen, her fingers curled around a glass of water when the horizon ignited. A series of coordinated explosions ripped through the industrial district below, the shockwaves rattling the reinforced glass of Jae-Min's fortress. One of those plumes of black smoke rose from the exact coordinates of the apartment Zara had called home for the last 6 months. It was a message written in fire and debris. The rival syndicate wasn't just hunting the white tiger, they had found his ghost, and they were intent on burning her out of the shadows. Zara watched the orange glow reflect in the window, her expression a mask of cold, tactical assessment that betrayed nothing of the hollow ache in her chest. Everything she owned, the few pieces of a normal life she had managed to scavenge, was now kindling. Jae-Min appeared at her shoulder, his presence a heavy, grounding weight. He didn't offer empty apologies. He simply looked at the devastation and then at her, his eyes dark with a shared understanding of what it meant to lose a sanctuary. "They're escalating," he said, his voice a low granite rasp that cut through the distant wail of sirens. "They're not just hitting targets, they're trying to strip us of our skin." "I thought I was safe because I was alone," Zara whispered, her voice like the sound of shifting gravel. "I thought isolation was armor." She turned to face him, the flickering light of the burning city casting long demonic shadows across the room. The destruction of her home was the final proof that her invisibility had failed. She was no longer a spectator in this war, but a catalyst. Jae-Min reached out, his hand hovering near her jaw before he closed the distance, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with a fierce, possessive certainty. "Isolation isn't protection, Zara. It's just a slow death," he countered, echoing the very words he'd used to pull her into his orbit. He looked toward the fire and then back to her eyes, which were now clear and decided. "We don't hide anymore. If they want a war of fire, we give them the sun." As the city continued to bleed light into the night sky, Zara felt the last of her hesitation incinerate. They were no longer two predators circling one another. They were a single, scorched entity preparing to hunt the monsters that thought they could make a Specter afraid of the dark. The industrial district smelled of rust and broken promises as Zara led Jae-Min toward the rusted iron maw of the city's subterranean veins. The steam tunnels were a claustrophobic maze of dripping pipes and hissing valves, a landscape Zara navigated with the haunting ease of a predator returned to its natural habitat. She moved in total silence, her tactical boots barely whispering against the slick concrete, while Jae-Min followed 3 steps behind, his presence a solid, grounding heat in the damp chill of the underbelly. This was the Specter in her element, calculating angles of attack and mapping blind spots in the darkness where others saw only shadow. "Watch the overhead line," Zara murmured, her voice a barely audible vibration that didn't even disturb the rats scurrying through the condensation. "The vibration from the factory floor above will mask our footsteps, but it also hides theirs." Jae-Min nodded, his rifle held with the practiced efficiency of a man who had traded his tailored silk for the cold weight of vengeance. The air grew thick with the scent of grease and cordite as they neared the vertical shaft leading directly into the rival syndicate's headquarters. Every hissing pipe seemed to whisper a warning, a reminder that they were no longer in the civilized world of boardrooms and tasting menus. They were in the guts of the city, where power was measured in blood and the only law was survival. As they reached the base of the access ladder, Zara paused, her hand flat against the vibrating steel. She looked back at Jae-Min, the flickering light of a dying bulb illuminating the raw wanting and unshakable authority in his gaze. There was no hesitation between them, only the synchronized precision of 2 monsters who had finally stopped performing and started living. "Once we go up, the mask is gone for good," she cautioned, her eyes searching his for any flicker of doubt. Jae-Min reached out, his hand cupping her jaw with a fierce, possessive certainty that felt like a vow. "I'm not looking for the mask, Zara. I'm looking for you." With a sharp, predatory smile, Zara turned and began the ascent. They were rising from the dirt to burn down an empire, 2 halves of one lethal whole ready to remind the world why humans should fear the dark. The factory floor erupted into a symphony of teeth and claws wrapped in gunfire. Zara breached the threshold first, her body reacting before thought could intervene as the metallic bite of gunpowder hit her senses, sharp, familiar, and almost nostalgic. She dropped her center of gravity, moving with a fluid grace that turned the industrial chaos into a deadly dance. Beside her, Park Jae-Min moved like liquid violence, his hand shooting out to catch an operative's wrist with the brutal efficiency of a man who had never actually stopped hunting. They fought back to back, a 2-person killing machine cutting through the rival syndicate's forces like a blade through silk. There was no need for commands, their synchronization was absolute, as if they had trained together for years instead of seconds. When Zara swept an attacker's legs, Jae-Min was already there to deliver the finishing blow. When a gunman flanked Jae-Min, Zara's suppressed weapon hissed, neutralizing the threat before he could even register her presence. The air between them crackled with a tension that was gravity and gasoline, an electric charge that sparked whenever they were close, fueled by shared trauma and a desperate need for connection. In the heat of the slaughter, Zara realized she had stopped being a ghost and he had stopped being a king. They were simply 2 predators who fit together with a devastating, terrifying perfection. Every movement was a whispered confession, a recognition deeper than attraction that acknowledged the monster beneath the skin. Zara felt his heartbeat hammering in rhythm with her own as they pressed together in the small spaces between containers, a raw wire's electricity arcing between them. This wasn't just a battle for territory or survival, it was a realization that isolation was a fiction they could no longer afford. As the last of the immediate threats fell into the shadows, Jae-Min's hand lingered at her waist, his grip possessive and certain. They stood amidst the wreckage, breathing hard, skin cooling in the grit-choked air, finally remembering they were human, even as they stood as monsters. The war was far from over, but the line had been crossed. They would burn everything they touched, but tonight they chose to burn together. The transition from the industrial guts of the factory to the skeletal heights of the rooftop was a climb through purgatory. Zara emerged into the biting night air, her wounded legs screaming with every step, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ice that settled in her marrow as she scanned the perimeter. There, silhouetted against the indifferent glow of the Los Angeles skyline, stood a figure she had seen in 1,000 nightmares, her old handler from the Shadow Division, a man whose presence meant her past had finally caught up to her invisibility. He didn't look like a gangster, he looked like a bureaucrat of death, and beside him stood the remnants of the rival Mafia, an unholy alliance forged to drag the Specter back into her cage. "Zara," the handler said, his voice a flat, terrifyingly familiar monotone that cut through the howling wind. "You've caused quite a disruption for someone who's supposed to be a ghost. The agency doesn't like losing its most effective hardware." Jae-Min stepped into the light beside her, his rifle raised, his jaw set in a line of granite that brooked no negotiation. The handler's gaze flickered to him with disdain. "And you, Park Jae-Min, you've let a weapon convince you she's a partner. It's a sentimental mistake that ends tonight." The rooftop erupted. Zara didn't think. She became the Specter, a blur of motion and muzzle flashes as her old training took over her muscle memory. She moved with a lethal, synchronized precision alongside Jae-Min, their backs to each other as they cut through the specialized operatives her handler had brought. This wasn't a street fight, it was a high-stakes hostage extraction where the hostage was her own soul. As the battle converged toward the roof's edge, Zara found herself eye to eye with the man who had authored her trauma. He lunged with a combat knife, his movements a mirror of her own, but he lacked the one thing that had fundamentally changed her, a reason to stay in the light. Zara parried with a brutal efficiency, her fingers finding a pressure point with surgical precision before she drove him back toward the precipice. "I'm not your hardware anymore," she whispered, her voice a rough, cold promise. She felt the rooftop give way to weightlessness, a desperate gamble involving a grappling line she'd anchored as insurance. As her handler disappeared into the dark void below, Zara hung suspended between the stars and the concrete, gasping for air that tasted like salt and hard-won victory. Jae-Min was there instantly, his hands shaking as he hauled her back over the ledge, his grip possessive and fierce. They stood together in the wreckage, two monsters who had survived the storm, knowing that while the agency would never stop hunting, tonight they had reminded the world what happens when you try to cage a Specter. The first light of dawn crawled over the Los Angeles skyline, painting the wreckage of the rooftop in shades of blood and gold. Zara stood at the edge, the wind whipping her hair, watching the city wake to a narrative that would inevitably be scrubbed and sanitized by the morning news. Below them, the gilded cage was a hollowed-out shell, and the rival syndicate was a memory cooling in the morgue. Zara looked down at her hands, steady, calloused, and finally free of the wine glasses she had used as a shield. The Specter was no longer a ghost haunting the periphery. She was a woman standing in the center of her own life. Jae-Min stood beside her, his presence a solid anchor against the shifting winds of the 42nd floor. He had stripped off his blood-stained suit jacket, appearing more like the tiger of the docks than the billionaire of the boardroom. He didn't ask her if she was ready. He simply watched the highway stretch toward the horizon like a promise written in asphalt. He knew, as she did, that the handlers would regroup and new enemies would sharpen their knives in the dark. Power hadn't made them safe. It had only made the target on their backs impossible to miss. "You said we were monsters," Zara whispered, her voice finally losing its mechanical edge. "That people like us don't get happy endings, we only get fire." Jae-Min turned her to face him, his hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a quiet revolution. "Then let's burn together," he said, echoing the vow they had forged in the heat of the slaughter. "Better to go down in flames with someone who sees you than to freeze in the shadows alone." He leaned down, his forehead touching hers, their breath mingling in the small, sacred space between heartbeats. They descended to the garage in silence, leaving behind the luxury and the lies that had nearly suffocated them both. As the Mercedes shot out into the morning light, leaving the city in the rearview mirror, Zara didn't look back. She wasn't running from a contract or a past she couldn't outrun. She was running toward a future that was dangerous, uncertain, and entirely her own. In a city built on fiction, she had finally found the only truth that mattered. She was no longer a weapon, and she was no longer alone. They were two monsters learning to love each other's teeth, driving into a dawn that was just beginning to burn. Thank you for riding out the storm with me until the very last mile. Knowing you stayed until the end truly means more than I can say. If Zara and Jae-Min's journey sparked something in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe and like button. It's how we keep this storytelling family growing. Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'm there reading, because to me, this isn't just a script, it's a real connection. And stay close. In a world of lies, the next truth is already sharpening its teeth in the shadows. I'll see you in the next story.